need to definitely take a look and see if you have a fatigue problem.
This really the driving force behind what you created, a methodology for that. It's called EnergyMD.
When they have chronic fatigue syndrome or they have long COVID.
And then go to the next step, which is replacing your deficiencies.
And then the toxicities are the toxic 5 that I've mentioned before: heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections.
The burnout syndrome, high dynamic, high performing, high demanding. Hello and welcome everyone to Khan Klinics, another episode powered by American Muslim Today. Today's episode is very unique. We have an emergency medicine physician, Dr. Evan Hirsch, who is an expert in functional and integrative medicine with deep specialization in treating chronic fatigue and conditions such as MECFS, standing for myalgic encephalitis and chronic fatigue syndrome, along with long COVID. Based in California, Torrance, Dr. Hirsch is affiliated with multiple hospitals and has over 20 years of medical practice experience. Combining his knowledge of functional, integrative, and environmental medicine, Dr. Hirsch developed a 4-step process that has helped thousands of patients worldwide restore their energy and vitality. His mission is clear: to reverse 1 million cases of low energy and fatigue. Beyond his professional endeavors, Dr. Hirsch is passionate about his personal growth. He enjoys singing musicals, learning new languages, dancing hip hop, and spending quality time with his wife and daughter. Dr. Hirsch, welcome to the studio, welcome to the show, and welcome to the podcast.
Amir, thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start with your journey. What led you into chronic fatigue research? And we understand that it started really from a personal note, something years ago, which led you going into this specific and niche branch. Would you like telling our audience a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So about 20 years ago, I started my family medicine residency here in Olympia, Washington. And I met my wife and we fell in love, and 3 months later, she couldn't get out of bed. So that was my first personal connection with chronic fatigue syndrome. We didn't realize at the time that it was chronic fatigue syndrome. I was doing my residency, and so I would speak with my attendings and specialists, and I was doing a bunch of research as much as I could, reading Harrison's textbook, and trying to figure out why she had such low energy. And conventional medicine, unfortunately, really didn't have the answers that I wanted. So I started to look for other answers. So I went into integrative medicine and functional medicine, and was able to help her so that in about 3 years, she was about 80% better. At that point in time, we got married and we had a child. I started my own practice. And a couple years after that, unfortunately, I got chronic fatigue syndrome, and it just about destroyed my life. My brain fog was so bad, I couldn't remember the patient who was sitting in front of me. I couldn't help out at home. My wife was obviously coming out of her chronic fatigue, and we had a new baby at home, and I couldn't play with her. She would say, "Daddy, play with me." And it broke my heart that all I wanted to do was lie on the couch. At my work, I would nap underneath the desk during lunchtime and other times when I didn't have patients because I just couldn't deal with the shame and I was exhausted. So I had body pain, I had this awful exhaustion, I had sleep issues. And then in one day, after lying on the floor underneath my desk, taking another nap for what seemed like the 1,000th time, I decided that I had to go on a journey to figure out what the causes were, because I knew if I could find all of the causes that I would get better. And so I went on a journey and I found over 30 different causes by looking through the research, talking to different specialists, reading different books, applying them to my patients. And then I started applying them to myself, and I found that I had 30 of the 38 different causes that I looked at. And I was able, as I worked on each of these, I was able to get better and better. I wrote a best-selling book on it that's now on Amazon called Fix Your Fatigue. And that became my mission. You know, I went online almost a decade ago, and my goal was to help 1 million people resolve their chronic fatigue, and now long COVID, which is very similar to chronic fatigue.
Excellent. We really appreciate your summary on that. And I can only imagine being a physician, having demands of work, and then on top of that, you have a new family, a young family, and you're hit with low energy. You're worried about this brain fog that is surrounding you and your professional demands in the midst of all of this. And this is not a story for Evans, for you just. It's a story across US for many of the people that are out there. The demands of work and not realizing that they have actually could give more than what they have, and there is a fatigue syndrome that is surrounding them. Tell us, what was the initial symptoms one should look for besides just feeling tired all the time about it? And what should one look for and say, well, I may have this chronic fatigue syndrome and I need to look into other causes and investigate this further. You were an MD, but a lot of people don't even realize, and they just get on with it, whereas they have a lot more to offer.
Yeah, as humans, we're incredibly adaptable, and we just think we're getting older. But the reality is that if we're sleeping well, or at least trying to give ourselves 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, and we're still tired throughout the day, where we're surviving on some sort of stimulant perhaps, so maybe it's caffeine, maybe it's coffee, maybe it's tea, maybe it's 5-hour energy. Maybe we find that our energy is crashing around 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, where we have to take a nap, or we just run out of energy as the day goes on. There's a problem. This is the body telling you that there's a problem and that you need to do something about it. So it's not just that you're getting older. I have people in my program who are 60, 70, 80 years old feel better now than they did when they were 30 years old. So, there's a lot that can be done, and you have to always start, like whether you have a problem at work in your human resources department or whether you have a problem in your car, you always have to come back to what is the cause, or in this case, the causes of the situation, so that you can be most successful. But it really starts off with identifying, I don't feel good, there's a problem here. Even when I sleep as much as I possibly can, I'm still tired. That tells you that you need to start looking
Excellent. And I can very relate to that, Evan, being a sleep specialist as well. You see that across especially elderly people or middle-aged people when they're seeing a difference in their performance. And they're saying, oh, I used to do that easily, I'm not doing it anymore. You're saying that you got to think about, oh, there could be some underlying other issue. Explain to our audience about a younger population having similar sort of issues. How would they compare their performance when they are not even entrenched in knowing, oh, I could do 70, 80% more? We know that the older population or the middle-aged population would know. What would your take be or message be for that younger audience that is out there and need to come and find your work?
So we're seeing a lot more of this with long COVID, but the message is still largely the same. I actually just had a conversation with a 22-year-old who for the last 14 months has not been able to get out of bed. So that's more extreme, but the issue is still the same, where if your energy is not relieved, if your tiredness is not relieved by rest, then that indicates that there's a probable problem. The other thing too is that there's something called post-exertional malaise, or PEM, which is basically when you exert yourself, you feel more tired. Now, when you go to exercise, oftentimes there is this Goldilocks dose where if you exercise too hard, you are going to feel a bit worse, but exercise oftentimes will energize us. And so you do have to pay attention to that, where if you are exercising too hard and you're feeling worse, you're basically stressing out the human organism, and it's something that you have to pay attention to. But if you have a tiredness that's not relieved by rest, when you're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night or so, then you need to definitely take a look and see if you have a fatigue problem.
Thank you for explaining that, Evan. This really leads to the next question. The driving force behind what you created, a methodology for that. It's called EnergyMD. It's got a very dynamic name. Give us a little first intro about it, and then we'll dip into it further and explore different parts of it.
So the 4-step process, this EnergyMD method that I created, came out of my last decade of work to figure out, how to get people better as fast as possible. So the first step is figuring out the causes that people have. The second step is to replace deficiencies that they have in hormones, nutrients, etc. And we can go into detail on these more in a little bit. The third step is to open up detoxification pathways. And then the fourth step, which is the most important step, is to remove the toxins that are present. Heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction that I find to be at the root causes of some of the other deficiencies that we see and over this total picture.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. So it's really a broad approach, but you've summarized it or categorized it into 4 branches, essentially. And the first branch being identifying what is your causes and just highlighting them first. You've mentioned in your work something that struck us a lot when we read through the research, talking about metal and molds. And yes, infection, people know. Would you explain a little bit, Evan, what do you mean by heavy metals and molds having effect or need to be identified and then probably later on rectified?
Yeah, so for people who I see who have chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, they all actually have all of the toxic 5, heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction. Now, these are all environmental toxins that we're exposed to on a regular basis. At some point in these people's lives who have chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID, they end up accumulating these toxins. So when we talk about heavy metals, mainly we're talking about things like lead exposure. So sometimes you can get these from mom through the placenta, as you can with all of these toxins, so that you come out into the world already having some toxins. And then there's exposures that you have along the way. So there used to be lead gasoline and lead paint on the walls, and oftentimes that was a lot of the exposure that we've had. Mercury is another heavy metal that people are exposed to quite often. You can get this in fish or anything that comes out of the ocean. You can also get it in silver fillings. So we call them silver fillings because they're half silver and they're half mercury. But every time you bite down, it can release mercury vapor and you can swallow it. So those are some of the heavy metals. Cadmium is another heavy metal that is found in cigarette smoke. So if you have had exposure from your parents or friends smoking, or if you have smoked yourself, sometimes you can have a buildup of cadmium. And all of these heavy metals can contribute to immune system dysfunction. So anything that's in the body that's not supposed to be in the body, it's the immune system's job to remove it. So whether it's heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or infections, the immune system is trying to get rid of these toxins. If it's not able to, it ends up attacking different parts of the body, causing autoimmune conditions in its process of trying to remove them. So that's heavy metals. In terms of chemicals, there's over 90,000 different chemicals that we're exposed to on a regular basis. Most of those have not been properly assessed for their health and safety. And then when we're looking at molds, most first world countries have about 50% or so of all of the buildings in first world countries have water damage, and most of those have molds. Molds are a neurotoxin. Heavy metals, chemicals, and molds all damage DNA and mitochondria, which produces our energy. Mitochondria is a part of the cell that produces about 70 to 90% of our energy. And when it gets damaged from these toxins, you're going to produce far less energy and you're going to be more fatigued. So those are a number of the environmental toxins that we're exposed to. And then the last one are infections. Everybody's obviously familiar with COVID. It's the newest infection on the block, but there are other ones like Epstein-Barr virus, which can cause mononucleosis, or cytomegalovirus, or HHV6, or there can be bacteria, there can be Lyme disease, some other different infections that can also contribute to this total body burden that causes a decrease in energy, an increase in body pain, problems with sleep. Oftentimes people become more sensitive to their foods and to their environment, but it's this overall accumulation that ends up causing chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID.
Excellent. And so that looks like quite a big list, Evan. How about, and this sounds like there's very slow stuff going on in some of the cases, chronic, and it's almost signs like, oh, it's poisoning your body. So you've got to be a little bit double careful here. How would we go about identifying these metals, molds, chemicals? Is there a blood test? Do you have to seek expert advice, go to a physician? Or is it you just have to start looking at doing an inspection of your surrounding and try to exclude? What would be the message that you would give our audience? How do we go about tackling it now?
So it's definitely important to start to take a look at your environment, but that can be overwhelming. But it depends on, the less toxins that you're exposed to, the better. And so you can definitely get a list, multiple different places on the internet, and just start to do better at decreasing your exposures. So if you want to decrease the amount of pesticides that you're exposed to, then start eating more organic food. If you want to decrease the amount of other chemicals you're exposed to, then start to buy products, cosmetics, etc., that you're putting on your face, you're shampooing with, that will decrease your exposures. Now, in terms of the testing, the best tests are actually urine tests. And I should say, for the physicians listening, this is nothing that I learned in medical school. This is additional trainings that I had to learn because I had chronic fatigue syndrome. I had to get over it. And then I also had to start helping the people who have chronic fatigue syndrome who come to see me. So what I found is that, first off, all of these tests and all tests in general are imperfect, and they are a snapshot in time. The second thing I should say is that all the people who have chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, they end up having, over the testing that I've done over the last decade, they end up having all of these toxins. So a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections. So I don't really do that much testing anymore. But for people who are interested, there are urine tests that will detect if there are mycotoxins in your urine, which are toxins produced by mold, if there are different chemicals and pesticides if you're in your urine, if there are different heavy metals like the lead and the mercury and or the cadmium and some other metals in your urine as well. So I do think that those are the best tests that are available. Now, when you feel sick and you have these symptoms, oftentimes your ability to excrete these toxins is diminished, which means when you do a test like this, you may not find that you have a lot of mycotoxins or chemicals or heavy metals. But once you start a program like ours, where we're opening up the detox and the drainage pathways, and you're excreting more of these toxins, if we were to do a test at that time, 3 or 6 months from now, you're going to be excreting a lot more, and you're going to find a lot more out in your urine. So this is one of the reasons why I decreased the amount of testing that I do, is because I saw so many cases where initially the testing that we did not show these toxins. But then as people move through the program, all of a sudden they're showing all of these toxins. And so that is why I have found that it is just better to save people money and to just go ahead and treat when they have chronic fatigue syndrome or they have long COVID, because in the end, they have all of those causes and they all need to be addressed.
Do they need to be enumerated? Do they need to be written down? And you mentioned that they do need to be identified, but are we saying that we do an intelligent, smart analysis and just try to just analyze what's around us and then put that down on paper and say, well, I'm going to work on this is how I'm going to approach my identification, and then go to the next step, which is replacing your deficiencies, if there are any, and limiting the exposure of the harmful substances that have already got to your body?
So when we look at the different causes that are present, we can break them into deficiencies. These are things that are not in the body that are supposed to be. These are things like hormones and vitamins and minerals. When we talk about hormones, that's like adrenals and thyroid and sex hormones. The mitochondria, which, as I mentioned, makes 70 to 90% of our energy. And then lifestyle habits. So not enough good food, not enough good water, not enough good sleep, not enough good movement. I consider all those deficiencies. And then the toxicities are the toxic 5 that I've mentioned before: heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction or trauma. When we're assessing for all of these different causes, about 90% of these can be determined by history and symptoms alone. So when I was in medical school, we learned that your diagnosis, about 90%, is going to be history and symptoms. 10% is going to be physical exam and laboratory tests. Mm-hmm. And we can do the same here. Now, when we're looking at chronic fatigue syndrome, it's a little bit different because I have found that people have the toxic 5. Now, they don't always have all of the other different causes, adrenal issues or thyroid issues or mitochondrial issues or etc. So that's where the 90% of the history plus symptoms comes into play. So for a lot of people listening to this, they may feel tired. They may not exactly have chronic fatigue syndrome, but for them, they need to sit down and we go through checklists, either when I'm working one-on-one with people or in our course or in our group programs, where you can go through and you can figure out, just based off your history and your symptoms, 90% of these different causes that we're looking at. Now, the other 10% require labs, but 90% is a very large number that can allow people to start right away in figuring out the causes that they have. And then you're just matching up the causes that you have with a treatment that works to remove and to fix that different cause.
Excellent. Oh, that really stems it down and explains it. I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Evan, for doing that. And let me go on to the next part of your work, and that is replacing your deficiency. You mentioned that these should be done on a routine basis. It's an ongoing process. It carries out throughout your life, more or less. And it's a necessary tool to heal. You've associated with healing. Tell us just briefly about how do you approach this part or this section of your research, and what advice would you give to the audience again as how do we go about creating a good checklist or a good manual to replace deficiencies that are in our body?
So the majority of the deficiencies, 80% or so, are actually caused by the toxic 5. So the toxins and their influence on the body end up causing the deficiency. So this doesn't mean we shouldn't address the deficiencies, because we have the deficiencies and replacing them in step 2, because we want to make the body more resilient. We want to make the human more able to deal with life. And so we want to increase their energy by optimizing their mitochondria, they can deal better with stress when their hormones are optimized. Everything works better when thyroid is optimized, when you have vitamins and mineral deficiencies that are optimized. And the thing that can empower people the most is by optimizing their lifestyle habits. So getting enough sleep. Make sure that you're getting 7 to 9 hours of good sleep a night. Making sure that you're going to bed as close to 9 o'clock as possible. Right? That's actually much better than going to bed at midnight. Having a nice evening that's not too stressful. No stressful arguments, no stressful television shows. Thinking everything that happens after dinner is all for the sake of sleep. I know you know this as a sleep expert. So really important to have blackout curtains in your room. Excellent. You know, if you need an eye mask, if you need, we like to recommend that people tape their mouth closed so that they can breathe more through their sinuses, which puts them more into their parasympathetic nervous system. So optimizing your sleep is key. And then drinking enough water. So 2 to 3 liters of water a day is essential, especially for people who are going through our program. They really need 3 liters of water a day in order to get rid of the toxins out of the body. And for the most part, as humans, we're existing in a dehydrated state. And it's amazing what happens. We're 5 liters of water flowing through our bodies at all times. And it's amazing what happens when you start to optimize the amount of water. A lot of people notice a significant improvement in their energy, in their mood, in their sleep when they just start drinking more water. The next thing is optimizing your dose of movement, right? There really is a Goldilocks dose where if you're working out too hard, it's too hard on the body, it's too stressful, and it's too much for you. But for the most part, more people need to move. In the United States, we've got an obesity rate of 75% of all of our population, of adults especially. So it's really important to make sure that you are moving your body. And this might be dancing to your favorite song. If you don't have a lot of time, if you're very busy, just every single day, put on your favorite song and dance hard for 3 to 4 minutes. And that can be incredibly important for your health. So we talked about water, we talked about movement, we talked about sleep, and then it's eating the right food. And for the most part, it's avoiding foods that aren't really healthy for us. So in my community, I recommend avoiding gluten and dairy and sugar and alcohol. And really what you're looking for is trying to get back to basics, how we were in this form tens of thousands of years ago when we first became Homo sapiens and we met nature and we ate meat and vegetables. We're omnivorous. And so that's what I found for people to be most successful. And sometimes it's hard for them to gauge what they should not be eating, but really what you should be eating is meat and vegetables and staying away from processed things and sugars as much as possible. And that can transform people's lives. So in step 2, that's kind of how we recommend that people go about doing it and optimizing them. So they are more resilient, they're stronger, so that when we get to step 4, it's easier for us to remove the toxic 5.
That's an excellent summary. I really appreciate that. Diet, sleep, water, movement, and some replacement. The next section is very interesting and I'm intrigued by it a little bit. Open up your drainage exit pathways. That's your month 3 regimen, sort of next step, or a month 3, I'm calling it. How does that function, or how does that work about? Open up your exit pathways. We don't hear about that much. Walk us through that a little bit, please.
So to get the toxins out of our body, it's really important to make sure that you have exit pathways available. So if anybody's ever tried to remove heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or infections out of their body by taking something over the counter, some detox package, or if they had Lyme disease and they went and saw a doctor and they got antibiotics, in general, you're going to feel like crap when you do this. And that's because step 3 is often missed. So we have different ways that we get toxins out of our body. We can breathe them out, we can pee them out, we can have bowel movements, and all of those pathways need to be open. So we have to be drinking enough water, like I mentioned previously. We have to make sure that we have a bowel movement or 2 every single day. And then internally, there's the kidney and the liver, and there's the lymph system, which is the garbage system of the body. And a lot of these different pathways, we call it phase 1, phase 2 detoxification of the liver. A lot of these pathways can be clogged, quote unquote, by the toxins that are present. And so consequently, opening them up using herbs, vitamins, minerals can be incredibly helpful at making sure that you have an exit pathway, because a lot of these toxins, they're stored in tissues, in organs and connective tissue. And when you start to pull them out of these different tissues, they have to have a place to go. Otherwise, they get recirculated back into the body in a different compartment. So you want to make sure that you have these pathways open in the liver, in the kidney, in the lymph, in the gallbladder, in the intestines, to make sure that they have a path to get out of the body. So I'm simplifying it, but the reality is that it's a very important part of this process to make step 4 even easier when we start to remove the toxins.
Excellent, excellent. So it's getting those toxins out of your system, whatever pathway you can find. You have the toxic 5 that need to get out to clean the body, and once it's cleansed, then you are on a different pathway. We continue this for the rest of the cycle, or the rest of the course or pathway. Tell us a little bit about how do we maintain it after we've exited out the toxins from the body. We're going on a new plan, an enriched new plan. Would that be correct?
Yes. And it takes at least 12 months to get these toxins out of the body for the people that I see who have chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID. So it's not, you have to understand that this process takes time. These toxins have been in your body in many cases since you were born. There are studies to show that over 300 different chemicals and toxins are found in baby's cord blood in the placenta.
Wow.
Right? So we come out with these toxins already in our bodies, and they just accumulate over time. So you can't really just get rid of them in the course of a month. For people who are very sick, it can take years sometimes. Typically 2 years, sometimes longer than that. And what we find is in about 12 months, people are 60 to 100% better to start to look at functional medicine, which is looking at areas of imbalance. Is this an inflammatory issue? Is this an immune issue? Is this a GI issue? What are the different issues that are present? And what is happening at the biologic level or biochemical level? And what are the actual, the root causes? Now, I wasn't able to learn about the toxic 5 until I went outside of functional medicine. Mm-hmm. And so then I went into environmental medicine, and I learned about heavy metals, and I learned about molds, and I learned about chemicals. And then I did additional trainings in chronic infections, and I did additional trainings in nervous system dysfunction or trauma in order to understand those more. So I don't know exactly what I'm practicing nowadays. It's this combination of functional medicine and environmental medicine and those other different components that I've mentioned. But it's always looking at, okay, what is the underlying root cause? Because I found that the toxic 5 is underlying most conditions. And when you remove them, most of the conditions that I used to treat in medical school and in residency would go away, and I wouldn't need the ongoing prescription in order to be able to manage a symptom over the long term.
Excellent. Conventional medicine, and I like it when you use that term, and then you use, and by the way, I'm doing some unconventional medicine here as well. And that's more like a web of multiple other integrated medicines, like you mentioned. Environmental medicine is holistic medicine. You also earlier just mentioned about how important it is to train your brain, your mental side of things. And you've incorporated that in your medicine, in your research, especially considering fatigue in modern life with the stresses we have is different from what we used to have, what it was 100 years, 200 years, or 5,000 years ago. How do you put that into your practice? What sort of advices do you give to your clients or your patients?
So the goal is to live more of our life in the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's something called the autonomic nervous system in the body, and there are two aspects, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight, flight, or free, and then the parasympathetic is more healing, rest, and digest. And most of the time that we're spending in modern society is in sympathetic. And if you are in your sympathetic nervous system, you cannot heal, you cannot relax for the most part, you won't digest well. And this is a major cause of so many illnesses that we see. I mean, you're especially familiar as a sleep doctor, right? You cannot sleep if you're not in your parasympathetic, right? So it's a very important part of the work that we do, and we do some nervous system retraining, and we have some mindset parts of this. There's also some breath work parts of this. And in the mindset, I've got a 4-step mindset practice that we have people do. The first step of that is to live in gratitude and to practice 3 gratitudes every day. Now, where gratitude lives, fear and anxiety cannot live, and this helps to put you into the parasympathetic. The second step of this is to envision your ideal health and envision your ideal life. This has been shown in clinical studies also to put you more into the parasympathetic. The next step is to look at your limiting beliefs and flip them into empowering beliefs or affirmation. And then the last step is to ask yourself empowering questions. Oftentimes, people that we see are asking themselves disempowering questions like, why is this happening to me, right? That your brain is a goal-achieving machine. If you ask it that question, it's going to tell you, and you're not going to be happy with the answer. But a better question is, how can I love myself more today? Or what can I do today to improve my health, right? The brain is going to give you answers that are going to be more supportive for you. So those things, paying closer attention to the thoughts and the feelings you're having through mindfulness and meditation, all of these things have been shown in their own right to put you more in your parasympathetic and improve chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID. So there's actually studies just on brain retraining that significantly improve people's energy and decreases their symptoms in chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID. So that's without even addressing the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, and the infection. So what I've put together here is this combination of all of the research that I have found that is available, that of all of these different causes that cause chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID. Because I know if I leave no stone unturned, I'm going to be successful.
I appreciate that response. You've put it very cutely with your other medicine, saying that mental health matters and proper training regarding this is critical, and you're given a pathway. Hey, Amir, if these are the 4 simple things you start working on today, you're going to see results down the road with our program. Really appreciate that. Let's just talk about the last 2 subjects, and one of them is the burnout syndrome and the great exhaustion you talk about. It's a challenge, and that challenge has to be addressed, and not everyone is able to cope in this high dynamic, high performing, high demanding world. You still come across and give us some guidelines how to navigate. Evan, tell us a little bit about this, and we know that is impacting us, but I would love to hear views on this.
So burnout, and you can get chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID from a number of different stressors. We've been talking about the toxic 5, which is a combination of physical stressors with the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections, as well as mental and emotional stressors like the nervous system dysfunction. When we're talking about burnout, oftentimes that is related to psychological stressors, the nervous system dysfunction that goes along with a psychological stressor. So whether this is, and by psychological I mean mental and emotional,
Sure.
and this can be something that's happening at work, this can be the stress of a home life, this can be always being in that sympathetic nervous system and not being in the parasympathetic nervous system, right? So all those different practices that I just mentioned definitely apply. So if you find that you go on vacation for an extended period of time and you start doing these practices and you're getting better, that means that there's a significant component of this that is mental and emotional. If you're able to relieve the mental and the emotional stressors, you are going to see improvement in your symptoms. And then the question is, what is left when it comes to the other toxic four, the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections? So once again, it's still very important to assess and be like, okay, where am I in the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight? And how do I get more into the parasympathetic? What are those techniques that I can do? Now, the challenge with today's society is that there's some arbitrary things that have been created that make life more stressful.
Sure.
For example, who came up with the 40-hour work week? Was that created because it was healthy for humans to do? No, it was actually created because this was the maximum amount of time that businesses could ask people to work without them rebelling. And so they found out that 40 hours a week and 2 days off is what people needed in order to not rebel against their work, and they would still be happy workers, right? So is 40 hours a week healthy for humans? I don't believe so. I think that it's hard because we're in this society, and so it's even more important for us to, because we're basically living in sympathetic activation during the 40 hours a week. And so after those times, when we're at home, when we're coming home in the car, how do we then unwind? How do we get more into the parasympathetic? Are you dancing and singing like I am? Are you doing a mindset practice? Are you meditating? What are the different ways that you can be more in your parasympathetic to deal with the stressors of today? And it's more than just working a 9-to-5 job. Now we have more access to all these phones, more challenges. We're dealing with our kids. More kids now there's over 30% of all teenagers now who have a mental health diagnosis. There was a recent study that studied 265,000 people who had long COVID, and 35% of those people had a new mental health diagnosis at 6 months, right? So there's a lot of different insults that we're dealing with that end up making it hard for us to heal and for our nervous systems to feel safe in today's society.
I like it. You go about talking this in light or in lieu with sympathetic and parasympathetic, and you bring about a good point. Try to live in your parasympathetic system. You got to live in a healed phase, restful phase. I appreciate that. That's a very good point. We're going to touch on the last topic, social media, its impact on our mental health, but especially the youth. And you've done some work in this field as well. What's your message, and how do we go about giving our youth this advice, which are very, very now connected, more so with the phone than anything else, and the social media than anything else than ever before in the history of human mankind?
I think it's important to look at what our kids are doing on the phone. You know, when they are on Facebook or Instagram, I guess they're not on Facebook because that's for old people like me, but when they're on Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat, they are in comparison. Oftentimes, other people are posting things about their life. People make their lives look great. And then the individual who doesn't have any tools because their brain's not completely formed and they haven't had appropriate coaching, you know, as parents, we don't know what we're doing most of the time. They don't realize that it's not real. They don't realize that these people who are posting and these influencers also have real life problems. So then they just think that their lives are awful, right? Because they're not able to be like these other people. So they're existing in comparison. My wife is a trauma expert. She talks about how comparison is the thief of happiness. Like if you don't want to be happy, then compare yourself to other people all the time. And so that is what's happening on social media. is that our kids are in constant comparison. And so then consequently, they're a lot more unhappy. And then oftentimes there's a lot more bullying that's happening. When you have a wall between you and the person in front of you, I mean, it's bad enough. We were bullied in elementary school and high school and all that sort of stuff, and that was to our face. When you are behind a phone, it's a lot easier to say off things to somebody because you can't see their reaction, right? And so I think that gives a lot of kids the ability or the license to be even more mean when they're communicating with other people. And so I think it's really important, more control over our children's phone and to introduce it as late as possible. And so I use an app called Custudio, Custudio, where I'm monitoring what my daughter is utilizing. And so we can have conversations about it, and we can have conversations about this, and I can say, how does it make you feel? Now she has access to music, and she has access to YouTube, but she doesn't have access really to much else. A little bit to Instagram because there's a group chat that she's on.
Sure.
But we have conversations about these things. And the question when I ask her about YouTube is, are you in there for education? Are you in there for entertainment, right? And are you in comparison? Sure. So I'm trying to bring a lot of mindfulness to her so that she realizes when if she's not feeling good in the context of her communications with the phone, because it's really hard to deny your child a phone at some point in their development. Everybody else has one.
Sure.
So the question is, how do we live with the phone, and how can we monitor it, and how can we have conversations with them, and thinking about, okay, what is my purpose in making this rule?
Sure.
You know, I tell her health and safety are always going to be times when I win, when the rules that I put down are most important. And so she may say, well, I don't believe that that's right. And then I can show her the research. There's so much research out right now. So I can say, this is the research on it. Whether you agree or not, this is the reality of the situation. These are the rules that we need to apply in order to keep you healthy and safe and make you as happy as possible.
Excellent. So you're going about it in a different way. The kids are mentally, physically exhausted by the social media, but you're going about this by asking them questions and asking them to answer it yourself. First of all, to say, hey, are you in this for entertainment or are you here for education? And that's what you said. And if it's education, you're asking for how long, but more importantly, if it's entertainment, how long are you going to have entertainment for? And what sort of entertainment is entertainment? So that sort of answers it very nicely. Dr. Hirsch, I really appreciate your time. It's been really an enlightening conversation. Thank you very much for doing this work.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate you.
We appreciate it. Thank you very much.